Millionaire grandma poses as housekeeper in Grandkids mansion. At the birthday party, she reveals the truth and the cake hides a secret that leaves everyone in shock. Hello, welcome, leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. In a luxurious Manhattan penthouse, an elderly woman in a maid's uniform dusts crystal vases worth more than her supposed yearly salary. Little do the residents know, she's the true owner of not just this apartment, but half the building. As she scrubs floors her grandchildren walk on, Margaret Holloway prepares for a revelation that will either mend her broken family or shatter it beyond repair. The birthday cake she's planning holds more than candles. It's the key to a decades-old secret that will test the true character of her progeny and determine the fate of a fortune. Margaret Holloway's wrinkled hands trembled slightly as she polished the ornate mirror in the foyer of the Thompson family's Upper East Side penthouse. At 78, she moved with a deliberate grace that belied her age. Her keen blue eyes taking in every detail of the opulent space she knew better than anyone else in the world. "Maria, where are you?" A shrill voice echoed through the marble-floored hallway. "The guests will be here in an hour, and this place is a mess." Margaret suppressed a sigh, straightening her plain black uniform before shuffling towards the voice. "Coming, Mrs. Thompson," she called out, her voice meek and accented, a perfect imitation of the Hispanic housekeepers she'd employed in her own homes for decades. Bethany Thompson, Margaret's granddaughter, stood in the center of the lavish living room, her perfectly manicured hands on her hips. At 35, Bethany was the spitting image of Margaret in her youth, all except for the hardness in her eyes and the perpetual frown that marred her beautiful features. "There you are," Bethany snapped, gesturing wildly around the room. "Look at this place. I told you I wanted everything to be perfect for Jason's birthday party. Do you have any idea how important this is? Half of New York's elite will be here." Margaret nodded subserviently, keeping her eyes downcast. "Yes, Mrs. Thompson. I'll take care of it right away." As she scurried around the room, dusting surfaces that were already immaculate, Margaret's mind wandered to the real reason for tonight's gathering. Yes, it was her grandson Jason's 30th birthday, but it was also the culmination of a plan she'd set in motion 6 months ago when she'd first donned this disguise. For years, Margaret had watched from afar as her late husband's fortune transformed her once close-knit family into a group of entitled strangers. Her son, Robert, had become a workaholic investment banker, more concerned with his golf handicap than his children's lives. Bethany had married for money and status, her 3 young children already showing signs of the same materialistic values. And Jason, sweet Jason who'd once dreamed of becoming a teacher, now worked 100-hour weeks at a soul-crushing law firm, chasing partnership and prestige. Margaret had tried everything to bring them back to earth. Stern talks, financial incentives, even threats of disinheritance. Nothing had worked. So, she decided on this elaborate ruse, a final attempt to see if there was any hope for the family she loved. As she fluffed the imported silk pillows on the Italian leather sofa, Margaret caught sight of a framed photo on the mantelpiece. It showed a younger version of herself, surrounded by her family at Jason's 5th birthday party. Their smiles were genuine then, their love for each other palpable even through the glass. "Maria," Bethany's voice cut through her reverie. "Don't just stand there daydreaming. The cake needs to be picked up from the bakery. Here's the address." She thrust a piece of paper into Margaret's hand. "And don't you dare be late. It's a very exclusive place, and I had to pull strings to get them to make it on such short notice." Margaret nodded, tucking the paper into her pocket. If only Bethany knew that the exclusive bakery was actually a front for the final phase of Margaret's plan. The cake, a seemingly innocuous centerpiece for tonight's party, held the key to everything. As she left the penthouse, Margaret allowed herself a small smile. In just a few hours, the truth would be revealed. The question was, would her family rise to the occasion, or would they prove that they were truly beyond saving? The sleek black town car glided through the bustling streets of Manhattan, its tinted windows concealing the transformation taking place inside. Margaret Holloway, no longer in her maid's uniform, sat regally in the back seat, Her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon. She smoothed down the front of her tailored Chanel suit, a far cry from the dowdy dress she'd been wearing just moments ago. "Everything is in place, Mrs. Holloway," her driver, James, said from the front seat. James had been with her for over 30 years, one of the few people privy to her true identity and plans. Mr. Goldstein called to confirm that the documents are ready. "He'll be at the party as planned." Margaret nodded, her stomach fluttering with a mix of anticipation and dread. "Thank you, James. And the cake?" "Being delivered as we speak, ma'am. Chef Antoine assures me that everything is exactly as you specified." As the car turned onto a quiet side street, Margaret's thoughts drifted to the events that had led to this moment. It had been a year since her beloved husband, Richard, had passed away. His death had hit the family hard, not just emotionally but financially. What none of them knew was that Richard, with Margaret's full support, had made some significant changes to his will in his final months. The car pulled up in front of a nondescript building. "We're here, Mrs. Holloway," James announced, opening her door. Margaret stepped out, straightening her spine. "I won't be long, James. Just a final check." Inside, she was greeted by the aroma of sugar and butter. Chef Antoine, a burly man with a thick French accent, rushed to meet her. "Madame Holloway, everything is perfect, just as you asked." He led her to a back room where a massive cake stood, 5 tiers of white fondant decorated with delicate sugar flowers. To the untrained eye, it was simply an extravagant birthday cake. But Margaret knew better. "The compartment?" she asked quietly. Antoine nodded, pointing to an almost invisible seam near the base of the cake. "It will open with the mechanism you provided. No one will suspect a thing until the moment of truth." Margaret ran her fingers lightly over the cake's surface, feeling the weight of what lay hidden inside. "Thank you, Antoine. You've outdone yourself." As she turned to leave, Antoine caught her arm gently. "Madam, forgive me for asking, but are you sure about this? It seems like such a risk." Margaret patted his hand, a sad smile playing on her lips. "My dear Antoine, sometimes we must risk everything to save what truly matters." Back in the car, Margaret closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of quiet reflection. The plan had been set in motion months ago, but its roots stretched back years, to the day she first noticed the change in her family. It had started small missed Sunday dinners, forgotten birthdays, increasingly lavish Christmas lists. But over time, it had grown into something monstrous. Her son, Robert, once a doting father, now spent more time with his clients than his children. Bethany, who dreamed of becoming a social worker, had married a man twice her age for his bank account. And Jason, her bright, compassionate grandson, was slowly withering away in a career he hated, all for the promise of wealth and status. Margaret had tried everything to bring them back: heartfelt talks, family vacations, even cutting off their trust funds temporarily. Nothing had worked. It was as if the money, the very thing Richard had worked so hard to provide for their family's security, had become a poison, corrupting everything it touched. That's when she'd hatched this plan. It was risky, potentially cruel even. But Margaret was out of options. Tonight, she would give her family one last chance to prove that the people she loved were still in there somewhere, buried beneath the designer clothes and social climbing. As the car merged back into traffic, heading towards the penthouse, Margaret's phone buzzed. It was a text from her old friend and lawyer, Stanley Goldstein. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Maggie? Once we start, there's no going back." Margaret's fingers hovered over the keypad for a long moment before she typed her response. "I'm sure, Stan. It's time they remember who they really are, even if it hurts." She put the phone away, straightening her jacket as the familiar skyline of the Upper East Side came into view. In just a few hours, everything would change. For better or worse, the truth would finally come out. As the car pulled up to the curb, Margaret took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "Well, Richard," she whispered to herself, "wish me luck. I'm going to need it." With that, she stepped out onto the sidewalk, ready to set in motion a chain of events that would either save her family or tear it apart forever. The Thompson penthouse buzzed with activity as New York's elite filtered in, air kisses and false compliments floating through the air like champagne bubbles. Margaret, now back in her maid's uniform, weaved through the crowd with practiced invisibility, her keen eyes taking in every detail. Jason, the birthday boy, stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, nursing a glass of scotch. His forced smile didn't reach his eyes as he nodded along to whatever the senior partner from his law firm was saying. Margaret's heart ached at the sight of her grandson, remembering the passionate young man who once talked about changing the world through education. "Maria!" Bethany's shrill voice cut through the party's din. "Where's that cake? The caterers need to know where to set it up." Margaret hurried over, keeping her eyes downcast. "It's in the kitchen, Mrs. Thompson. I'll show them." As she led the caterers to the massive cake, Margaret caught snippets of conversations around her. "Did you hear about the Holloway fortune? Rumor has it the old lady's gone batty. I heard she's living in some retirement community in Florida. Well, I heard she's holed up in Switzerland, refusing to see anyone." Margaret suppressed a smile. If they only knew. Across the room, Robert Thompson, Margaret's son, was deep in conversation with a group of investors. His eyes darted constantly to his phone, fingers twitching as if longing to check the stock market even at his son's birthday party. As the cake was wheeled into place, a hush fell over the room. It truly was a masterpiece, towering over the guests with its intricate sugar work and delicate fondant flowers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bethany announced, her voice sickly sweet, "it's time to sing happy birthday to my darling brother, Jason." The crowd gathered around, their voices rising in a cacophony of off-key singing. Jason stood before the cake, his smile not quite reaching his eyes as he looked at the 30 candles blazing atop the confection. "Make a wish, honey," Bethany chirped, her camera at the ready. Jason hesitated for a moment, his gaze sweeping across the room. For a split second, his eyes met Margaret's, and she saw a flicker of something: recognition, longing, before he closed them and blew out the candles. The crowd applauded, and Bethany began ushering people towards the bar for more champagne. But before anyone could move to cut the cake, a commanding voice rang out across the room. "I believe it's time for the real celebration to begin." All heads turned to see Stanley Goldstein, Margaret's lawyer, standing in the doorway. His presence, unexpected and unexplained, sent a ripple of confusion through the party. "What's the meaning of this?" Robert demanded, striding towards Stanley. "Who invited you?" Stanley smiled, a mix of amusement and determination in his eyes. "I'm here on behalf of Margaret Holloway." A gasp went through the crowd. Bethany's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. "Grandmother," Jason whispered, his eyes wide. Margaret took a deep breath, straightening her spine. It was time. With steady hands, she removed the gray wig and wiped away the makeup that had aged her face. As she shed the maid's uniform to reveal the elegant suit beneath, a collective gasp echoed through the room. "Hello, my darlings," Margaret said, her voice strong and clear. "I believe we have some matters to discuss." The penthouse fell into a shocked silence, broken only by the distant honking of New York traffic far below. Margaret stood tall, her silver hair gleaming under the chandelier's light, as she faced her stunned family. Bethany was the first to recover, her face contorting with a mix of confusion and anger. What is this? Some kind of sick joke?" Robert stepped forward, his usual confident demeanor shaken. "Mother, what's going on? Why were you pretending to be our maid?" Margaret's eyes swept across the room, taking in the faces of her family and their guests, a sea of shocked expressions and whispered conversations. "I think perhaps we should have this discussion in private," she said calmly. "Stanley, if you would?" Stanley Goldstein nodded, addressing the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid I must ask you to leave. Family matters, you understand." As the guests filed out, a mixture of scandalized whispers and excited gossip trailing in their wake, Margaret's family remained rooted in place. Jason hadn't moved from his spot by the cake, his eyes never leaving his grandmother's face. Once the last guest had departed, Margaret took a seat in one of the plush armchairs, gesturing for her family to do the same. "I suppose you have questions," she began. "Questions?" Bethany practically shrieked. "You've been lying to us for months, spying on us in our own home. How could you?" Margaret's gaze hardened. "How could I? How could you, Bethany? All of you. Look at what you've become." She turned to Robert. "When was the last time you attended one of your children's school events? Do you even know what grades they're in?" Robert flinched, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Margaret continued, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "And you, Bethany, you used to talk about changing the world, helping those less fortunate. Now you can't even treat the help with basic human decency." Bethany's face flushed red, but before she could retort, Margaret turned to Jason. "And you, my dear, when was the last time you smiled and meant it? When was the last time you did something because you wanted to, not because it would look good on your resume?" Jason's eyes filled with tears, his shoulders slumping as if a great weight had settled upon them. Stanley cleared his throat, stepping forward with a briefcase in hand. "Perhaps now would be a good time to explain the legal aspects of the situation, Margaret?" Margaret nodded, her expression grave. "Yes, I suppose it is." She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "Your grandfather and I made some changes to our will before he passed. Changes that, until now, have been kept secret." Robert leaned forward, his business instincts kicking in despite the surreal situation. "What kind of changes?" "The kind that will determine the future of this family and every penny of the Holloway fortune," Margaret replied. She nodded to Stanley, who opened his briefcase and began distributing thick envelopes to each family member. "Inside these envelopes," Margaret explained, "you'll find the details of a challenge, a series of tasks, if you will, designed to test not your business acumen or social connections, but your character." Bethany ripped open her envelope, her eyes scanning the contents frantically. "This is insane. You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious in my life," Margaret replied firmly. "For the next month, each of you will be given assignments. How you choose to complete them, or if you choose to complete them at all, will determine your inheritance." Robert's face had gone pale as he read through his own documents. But what about the company? Our investments? All frozen," Stanley interjected. "For the duration of this challenge, you'll each be given a modest stipend to live on. Nothing more." The room erupted into chaos, Bethany and Robert talking over each other in a panic. But Margaret's attention was drawn to Jason, who had been silent throughout the entire exchange. He met her gaze, a mix of fear and, was that hope, shimmering in his eyes. "And what if we refuse?" Bethany demanded, her voice cutting through the noise. Margaret's expression was unyielding. "Then you forfeit your share. Everything, and I do mean everything, will be donated to charity." A heavy silence fell over the room as the gravity of the situation sank in. "Now," Margaret said, rising from her chair, "I believe there's a cake waiting to be cut. And trust me, my dears, you'll want to see what's inside." As she moved towards the towering confection, her family trailing behind in stunned silence, Margaret allowed herself a small, sad smile. The storm had broken, and now all that remained was to see if her family would weather it together or be torn apart by the tempest of truth she had unleashed. The Holloway Thompson family gathered around the massive cake, tension thick in the air. Margaret's fingers hovered over the base, searching for the hidden mechanism Chef Antoine had installed. With a soft click, a panel slid open, revealing a compartment filled with envelopes, each bearing a family member's name in Margaret's elegant script. "What is this?" Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret began distributing the envelopes. "These contain your first assignments. But before you open them, there's something else you need to see." She reached deeper into the cake's hidden compartment and pulled out a weathered leather-bound journal. The room fell silent as Margaret opened it, revealing pages filled with familiar handwriting. "This was your grandfather's journal," Margaret explained, her voice thick with emotion. "He started writing it the day Robert was born, and continued until just before he passed away." She flipped through the pages, stopping at a dog-eared section. "I'd like to read you something he wrote, about a year before he died." Margaret cleared her throat and began to read. "I fear I've made a terrible mistake. In my desire to provide for my family, to give them the security I never had, I may have robbed them of something far more precious. I look at my son, so consumed by the pursuit of more that he's forgotten the joy of enough. I see my grandchildren, blessed with every opportunity, yet somehow impoverished in spirit. What legacy am I truly leaving behind? Not one of love and compassion, as I'd hoped, but of greed and discontent. Margaret, my love, if you're reading this, know that I trust you to make this right, to remind them of who they truly are, of the values we once held dear. It may not be easy, and they may resent you for it, but I believe it's the only way to save our family from the curse of our own success." As Margaret's voice trailed off, she looked up to see tears streaming down Jason's face. Bethany had sunk into a nearby chair, her expression unreadable, while Robert stood rigid, his jaw clenched tight. "This challenge," Margaret continued, closing the journal gently, "is your grandfather's final gift to you, a chance to rediscover what truly matters." She gestured to the envelopes in their hands. "Your first assignments are inside. You have 24 hours to decide whether you'll participate. If you choose to accept, you'll have 1 week to complete your task. Stanley will be overseeing the process to ensure fairness." Robert was the first to tear open his envelope, his eyes widening as he read the contents. "This is... You can't be serious." Bethany followed suit, her face paling. "No, absolutely not. I won't do it." All eyes turned to Jason, who had yet to open his envelope. With shaking hands, he broke the seal and pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. As he read, a range of emotions flickered across his face: shock, fear, and finally, a glimmer of something that looked almost like relief. "Well?" Bethany demanded. "What does yours say?" Jason looked up, meeting his grandmother's gaze. I think I need some time to think about this." Margaret nodded, a soft smile playing at her lips. "Of course. You all have until this time tomorrow to make your decision. Remember, this isn't just about the money. It's about who you are, who you want to be." As the family dispersed, each lost in their own thoughts, Margaret caught Stanley's eye. He gave her a reassuring nod, but she could see the concern etched in his features. This was a gamble, and they both knew it. Everything hinged on the next 24 hours. Margaret made her way to the window, looking out over the glittering New York skyline. Somewhere out there, beyond the towers of steel and glass, lay the future of her family. Would they rise to the challenge, or would the allure of easy wealth prove too strong? Only time would tell. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of tension and hushed conversations. Margaret had taken up residence in the penthouse's guest room, her presence a constant reminder of the choice that loomed before her family. As the deadline approached, Margaret sat in the living room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Stanley stood nearby, his briefcase at the ready. The air was thick with anticipation as they waited for the family to assemble. Robert was the first to arrive, his usual impeccable appearance slightly disheveled. Dark circles under his eyes suggested a sleepless night. He nodded curtly to his mother but remained silent, pacing near the windows. Bethany swept in next, her face a mask of cold determination. She took a seat across from Margaret, her posture rigid, eyes never leaving her grandmother's face. Minutes ticked by, and still, there was no sign of Jason. As the clock struck the hour, Margaret's heart sank. Had she pushed too far? Had she lost her grandson for good? Just as she was about to speak, the elevator chimed. Jason stumbled in, out of breath, his clothes rumpled as if he'd slept in them. "Sorry I'm late," he gasped. I needed to do something first." Margaret nodded, relief washing over her. "You're here now. That's what matters." She took a deep breath, looking at each of her family members in turn. "Well, I suppose it's time. What have you decided?" Robert stepped forward, his jaw set. "I'll do it," he said, his voice gruff. "I don't like it, and I think this whole thing is cruel. But I'll do it." Bethany's laugh was bitter. "Of course you will. Always the dutiful son. Aren't you, Robert?" She turned to Margaret, her eyes flashing. "I refuse. This is manipulative and wrong. I won't be a part of it." "Bethany," Margaret began, but her granddaughter cut her off. "No, I don't want to hear it. You can keep your money and your moral high ground. I'm done." With that, she stormed out of the room, the elevator doors closing behind her with a final sounding thud. The room fell silent, the weight of Bethany's decision hanging heavy in the air. Finally, all eyes turned to Jason. He stepped forward, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Before I give you my answer, I need to show you something." He pulled out his phone, tapping on the screen before handing it to Margaret. On the screen was a confirmation email. Margaret's eyes widened as she read, "Dear Mr. Thompson, we are pleased to confirm your enrollment in our Master of Education program, starting next semester. We look forward to welcoming you to our community of future educators." Margaret looked up, tears welling in her eyes. "Jason, you?" He nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "I've been thinking about it for a long time. Last night, I realized I couldn't keep living a life that wasn't mine. So yes, Grandma, I accept your challenge." Margaret rose, enveloping her grandson in a fierce hug. Over his shoulder, she saw Robert watching, an unreadable expression on his face. As Jason and Margaret separated, Stanley cleared his throat. "Well then, shall we proceed with the first assignments?" Robert nodded grimly. "Let's get this over with." Margaret returned to her seat, her heart both heavy and hopeful. She had known this wouldn't be easy, that there would be pain and resistance. But as she looked at her son and grandson, she saw a glimmer of the men they could be, the men she knew they were deep down. The road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and likely more than a few heated arguments. But for the first time in years, Margaret felt a spark of real hope for her family's future. As Stanley began outlining the details of their first tasks, Margaret silently said a prayer. For Robert, that he would find his way back to the caring father he once was. For Bethany, that she might find her way back to them, to herself. And for Jason, that he would have the courage to pursue his dreams, to become the man she knew he could be. The journey had only just begun. As the warm glow of sunset bathed the Manhattan skyline, Margaret sat in her temporary office, once a guest bedroom in the penthouse. Her eyes scanned the reports before her, detailing the progress of Robert and Jason's first assignments. A week had passed since they'd accepted the challenge, and today marked the deadline for their initial tasks. A soft knock at the door pulled Margaret from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. Stanley entered, his usual crisp suit slightly rumpled, betraying the long hours he'd been putting in. "They're here," he said simply. Margaret nodded, taking a deep breath to center herself. "Let's not keep them waiting, then." They made their way to the living room, where Robert and Jason sat on opposite ends of the plush sofa. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. "Well," Margaret began, settling into an armchair across from them, "shall we discuss how you fared with your first assignments?" Robert cleared his throat, sitting up straighter. "I've done as you asked," he said, his tone clipped. "I spent the week working at the soup kitchen on 42nd Street. I have the signed log to prove it." Margaret nodded, her expression neutral. "And what did you learn from the experience, Robert?" He shifted uncomfortably. I saw things I've never really paid attention to before. People struggling, people who've fallen through the cracks. It was eye-opening. "And did you speak with any of them? Learn their stories?" Margaret pressed. Robert's gaze dropped to the floor. I tried. It wasn't easy. But there was this one woman, Maria. His voice caught. "She reminded me of you, actually. Same age, same spark in her eyes. But she lost everything in the 2008 crash. Her story, it could have been us, you know? If things had gone differently. Margaret's eyes softened. Thank you for sharing that, Robert. I know it wasn't easy. She turned to Jason, who had been fidgeting nervously. And you, dear? How did you fare with your task? Jason took a deep breath. I did it. I quit the law firm. A gasp escaped Robert. You what? Jason, do you have any idea? Robert. Margaret cut in sharply. Let him finish. Jason continued, his voice growing stronger. I not only quit, but I also spent the week shadowing Mr. Gonzalez at PS 118 in the Bronx. I've never felt more fulfilled, more like myself. He reached into his bag, pulling out a stack of colorful papers. The kids, they wrote me thank you notes. Can you believe it? I helped with one math lesson, and they act like I changed their lives. Margaret smiled, warmth blooming in her chest. Perhaps you did, Jason. Perhaps you did. Robert looked between his mother and his son, bewilderment clear on his face. I don't understand. How is Jason throwing away his career supposed to help anything? Is it truly throwing something away if it was making him miserable? Margaret countered gently. Robert, when was the last time you saw your son smile like this? Robert fell silent, his brow furrowed in thought. Margaret leaned forward, her gaze intense. This challenge isn't about punishing you or taking away your success. It's about rediscovering what truly matters. It's about remembering who you are beneath the titles and the bank accounts. She stood, moving to the window. The city lights twinkled below, a tapestry of millions of lives intertwined. Your grandfather built this fortune from nothing, but he never forgot where he came from. He never lost sight of the people behind the numbers. Turning back to her family, Margaret's voice was filled with emotion. That's the legacy he wanted to leave. Not just wealth, but compassion, understanding, a desire to make the world better, not just for ourselves, but for everyone. The room fell silent as her words sank in. Jason's eyes shone with unshed tears, while Robert's face was a mask of conflicting emotions. Finally, Robert spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. What's the next task? Margaret smiled softly. Eager to continue, are we? Very well. She nodded to Stanley, who produced 2 more envelopes. As Robert and Jason reached for their next assignments, the elevator chimed. All heads turned to see Bethany step into the room, her usual polished appearance slightly frayed around the edges. She began, her voice wavering. I think I made a mistake. Is it too late to join? Margaret's heart soared. My dear, she said, moving to embrace her granddaughter. It's never too late to find your way back home. As the family gathered, the air thick with a mixture of trepidation and hope, Margaret couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, they were on the right path. The journey ahead would be challenging, filled with difficult truths and hard-earned lessons. But for the first time in years, they were facing it together. And that, Margaret thought, was the greatest victory of all. 3 weeks had passed since that pivotal evening, and the Holloway-Thompson family found themselves once again gathered in the penthouse living room. The atmosphere, however, was markedly different from their previous meetings. Gone was the suffocating tension, replaced by an air of cautious optimism and budding understanding. Margaret sat in her usual armchair, her keen eyes taking in the subtle changes in her family. Robert, his tie loosened and jacket discarded, looked more relaxed than she'd seen him in years. Jason's posture was open, his eyes bright with a renewed sense of purpose. And Bethany, who had joined the challenge late, sat perched on the edge of the sofa, her usual haughty demeanor softened by the humbling experiences of the past weeks. Well, Margaret began, a small smile playing at her lips. Shall we discuss your final assignments? Robert cleared his throat. I spent the week managing the budget for that homeless shelter, the one where I met Maria. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of vulnerability so unlike his usual polished demeanor. It was challenging. I've dealt with billions in my career, but making every dollar count when lives are on the line, that's a whole different ballgame. Margaret nodded encouragingly. And what did you learn from the experience? Robert's eyes met hers, a newfound depth in his gaze. That maybe I've been measuring success all wrong. The joy on those faces when we managed to fund an extra meal service? That felt better than any deal I've ever closed. Jason leaned forward, his excitement palpable. I finished my week student teaching at PS 118. Grandma, it was incredible. Those kids, they have so much potential, so much enthusiasm. But the resources just aren't there. He paused, a determined look crossing his face. I want to do more. Not just teach, but really make a difference in the education system. Bethany, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, spoke up. I spent my week at the women's shelter. Her voice wavered slightly. I thought it would be easy, you know? Write a check, maybe organize a fundraiser. But actually being there, hearing their stories, she trailed off, blinking back tears. I've been so blind, so caught up in my own little world. There's so much pain out there, so much need, and we have the power to help. Margaret felt her heart swell with pride and hope. My dears, she said, her voice thick with emotion, I am so incredibly proud of each of you. You've shown courage, compassion, and a willingness to grow that goes beyond anything I could have hoped for. She stood, moving to the center of the room. This challenge was never about the money. It was about remembering who you are, who we are as a family. Your grandfather built this fortune not just for our comfort, but as a tool to make the world a little bit better. Stanley, who had been quietly observing from the corner, stepped forward with a stack of documents. Now, he said, his tone businesslike but with a hint of warmth, we need to discuss the future of the Holloway fortune. For the next hour, they pored over proposals and plans. Robert's financial acumen, once used solely for profit, was now directed towards maximizing the impact of their charitable giving. Jason's passion for education formed the cornerstone of a new foundation aimed at supporting underfunded schools. And Bethany, her social connections repurposed for good, outlined a series of fundraising galas that would bring attention to overlooked causes. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the Manhattan skyline, Margaret looked at her family with a sense of wonder. They weren't perfect. There were still disagreements, still moments of old habits creeping in. But there was also laughter, genuine conversation, and a shared sense of purpose that had been missing for far too long. I think, Margaret said, her voice soft but filled with conviction, that your grandfather would be very proud of the legacy you're building. Robert smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that took years off his face. Thanks, Mom, for everything, for not giving up on us. Jason nodded in agreement. Yeah, Grandma, you took a huge risk with this whole plan, but I think it saved us. Bethany reached out, taking Margaret's hand. I'm sorry I almost walked away. Thank you for giving me another chance. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. Oh, my dears, there will always be another chance, as long as we're willing to take it. As the family continued to talk, making plans and sharing ideas, Margaret quietly slipped away to the balcony. The city stretched out before her, a tapestry of lights and lives. Somewhere out there, lives were already being changed by the ripples of her family's transformation. Well, Richard, she whispered to the night air, imagining her late husband's presence beside her. I think we did it. It wasn't easy, and Lord knows it isn't over. But I think our family has found its way back to what really matters. A warm breeze caressed her face, carrying with it the sounds of laughter from inside. Margaret smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But for the first time in years, she was excited to see where it would lead. As she turned to rejoin her family, Margaret knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And in that unity, in that rediscovered sense of purpose and love, lay the true wealth of the Holloway legacy. Thank you for listening until the end. Share your opinion about the story in the comments and let us know which character you liked the most. If this story touched you and you want to hear more, click on the next story appearing on your screen. Leave a like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a great community of people who share emotional stories together. Until the next story.